Even if we don't subscribe to the oft-quoted phrase of Jordan Peterson that there is a crisis of masculinity, we may accept that young men live lives in an era where their roles and responsibilities remain subject to intense scrutiny. Liberal society endorses a particular type of man, a new man, domesticated and refined, sensitive and progressive. Conservative criticism seeks to return, or at least how they see it, to a man more in tune with his biological yearnings. The need to be strong and unperturbed by any woolly notions of emotional intelligence. A young Muslim male living this experience is often also confused by the messages coming from Muslim quarters. You can find contemporary Islamic commentary that would back up both liberal and conservative narratives, all looking to paint a type of man in tune with modernity or suited to a time where, as the phrase goes, men knew how to be men. My guest today, Ameen, from the popular Mind Heist podcast, is a young man trying to make sense of this world. Intuitively, he felt both narratives were missing something, and that is the role of revelation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not leave men or women to their base impulses, because without direction, human beings are destined to lead unfulfilled lives. Ameen set off on a journey to discover what Islam expects from a man, and in his own words found conclusions that challenge his own perceptions. He is in the process of putting his thoughts down on paper and is currently writing a book on the subject, and I caught up with him last week to discuss the project and his findings. Brother Ameen, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim podcast. I must say, it's really a pleasure and an honor to have you on my show this week. Many members of my family, especially the younger members, are all looking forward to your interview. They follow your Mind Heist podcast quite closely, and alhamdulillah, they really appreciate the work you're doing.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallahu khairan for having me. And, it's an honor to be on a podcast with, I feel like all your guests are much higher in stature than me, mashallah. So I'm going to try my best here to bring something of substance. Just thanks for having me. I think the podcast is good. The programs you're putting out are good, what I've seen so far. And may Allah put barakah in it.
Ameen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really make this conversation fruitful and bring some clarity really to this subject of young males and masculinity and what it means to be a man in the modern world, in the modern era. I'm interested to understand more about your findings, but before we get to that, I would like to really understand your motivations. What led you to write this book on Muslim masculinity or masculinity according to the Islamic perspective?
Yeah, so it's a good place to start. Good question. So I think there's like three main reasons. Okay, so the first is that since about, age 20, I've always been into, just developing myself, always learning, always developing, looking at, my psychology or improving my general behaviors and habits and stuff like that. So I, like age 20 or 21, I remember I attended, I think it was a webinar by Productive Muslim. So I was into productivity. I've been through all the Tony Robbins and the Brian Tracy and all that. So I've generally been into this, right? And this topic of what I guess I'm calling it the Islamic model for masculinity, right? This, I think, is a vehicle for men to improve themselves. So ultimately, I see this topic as one of personal development and not necessarily one of like Islamic kind of shari'i or fiqhi knowledge per se, but it's a way that Muslim men can develop themselves, but instead of using the tools and the worldview that are given to them elsewhere from other places, they're actually going straight to the source, which is the Quran, the Sunnah, the scholars of our religion, to help them develop themselves, improve themselves, and no doubt Islam encourages us constantly to improve ourselves anyway, men or women, right? So that's like the first reason. The second reason was, honestly, I used to be on Twitter. It's been a few years since I left Twitter now, and I came across a lot of tweets that made me feel uncomfortable, right? These tweets usually were by you could say, feminist-leaning Muslim women, okay? And the contents of their tweets might make me feel uncomfortable. They might have made me, want to, have a knee-jerk reaction and kind of maybe argue with them, right? I think for the most part, I kind of restrain myself, but it made me really reflect on, okay, I'm uncomfortable with what they're saying, but why am I uncomfortable, right? Like, how can I, if what I think is right and what they think is wrong, I need to have substance in my response to that. Like, how would I respond to that? So that kind of taught me to restrain myself and actually eventually just leave Twitter. But it made me think still, like, people are confused about, the whole area of gender roles, for example. Should there be gender roles? This is a big question amongst Muslims. I think in the non-Muslims in the West, it's kind of a foregone conclusion, right? But for Muslims, there's still a lot of questions around this. So, let me actually try to form a good answer to this. Let's bring substance. And it might not be adequate for those who are not fully on the Quran and Sunnah train, if you like, in terms of like, we'll just take this and roll with it. So it might not be adequate for them, but for those who really do want to follow and they want to take their world view from Islam and what Allah's giving us in terms of the best way to live, then inshallah it will be something of substance, and it will help them understand, ultimately it's like their role in life and their role in society, right? So I think it's really important. And ultimately it's just my annoyance that I'm uncomfortable with these ideas I'm hearing. But it's like, okay, if you're serious, you need to find a way to respond to it, right, with substance. And then the third reason is ultimately, inshallah, I think most Muslims I speak to, they have a goal of improving the state of the ummah, right? And ultimately, I think the change happens bottom up. And I think the bottom would be the Muslim family. And we hear of many problems between Muslims, whether it's siblings, parents, husband and wife, children, this and that. So this is my contribution to helping to mend the issues we have amongst the families, because I truly believe that if we have strong families, that kind of will solve 80% of the issues, inshallah.
That's really interesting. I want to pick up on the third point you mentioned as the reason why as to why you want to address the subject of masculinity. I mean, often I completely agree with you, but the Muslim family it has to be resolved, and not enough attention is placed on the Muslim family and how it can operate today. However, most prescriptions so far tend to sort of pick up on parenting and I don't know, the role of the wife, maybe even the role of the husband and wife, right, as a unit. Very few people have picked up on the topic that you're covering, which is masculinity, and is there an Islamic conception of masculinity? Why do you see masculinity to be at the root, or do you? But why do you see it to be at the root of a good, healthy family?
I can't say it's like the number one way to fix it, right? I think it's very significant, though. Okay, there are other factors, right? There is for example, ultimately, I think each person needs to take responsibility for the problems they're causing in the world. Like, let's be real, I'm probably causing problems right now for my parents or my children, whatever it is, or my neighbors, right? We're all causing, whether it's small problems or large problems, for our families and for the society at large, right? With some little things we're doing here and there. And so I think everyone needs to take responsibility for the good and the bad that they do. And ultimately it's on yourself to better yourself, and that will help better the world, right? So very, very much bottom up approach. And because I'm a man, because I got interested in this topic, I just applied it there. So I said, okay, if Muslim families are going to change, and I'm a Muslim man, I need to take it upon myself to A, improve myself, and B, that will hopefully trickle down, or whatever you want to call it, onto my family, right? Onto my wife, onto my children. And then that will then help my children's friends and my wife's friends and this and that. So it's the approach of putting all the responsibility on yourself, ultimately, to improve things, right? And being a man, and feeling like, I guess it's an audience that I would like to address. I'm telling myself and anyone who would read the book eventually that it's all on you. That's all you should be focusing on, is what you're doing right or wrong and improving it.
To what extent do you subscribe to the notion, I think put forward by people like Jordan Peterson, that there is a crisis of masculinity and males no longer have a place in this new world, and as a result, many of the problems we face in families and wider society stem from this basic crisis of identity that most males feel?
Yeah. Jordan Peterson, I think some of what I've heard from him in terms of psychology is very, very interesting. In terms of the general idea of there being a crisis of masculinity, I do agree with that. Obviously, crisis is maybe dramatic, but yes, it's a big problem, right? And I really do believe it affects the family dynamics, etc. Where does that come from? Why is that the case? There's so many reasons, right? But I think, for example, from a technology point of view, since the Industrial Revolution, the society has lost the need for a lot of men in a way, right? So before, just on a very basic level, physical labor was more important before. Right? Now it's less important. We have robots to do stuff, right? So just on a very basic level, you can see how one of the main traits or things that men brought to the table is now no longer needed. It's done by robots, for example. It's done by factories, machines, etc. So we can take that and we can expand it, further and further. For example, now we don't need men who are ready to go and defend the country because we have a professional army. We don't need men to sort out brawls in the street and correct people because we've got professional police now, right? So a lot of the roles that men played, the important roles men played, they're no longer important, right? On top of that, we have, certain things like the feminist movement, which ultimately, although the feminist movement is supposed to focus on, the role of women in society, it really is trying to dictate the role of men as well, because as you give women certain new roles, that often leads to taking away men's roles, and it also tries to add roles to men that they didn't have before, right? So technology's changed a lot of things, the shape of the economy's changed a lot of things, globalization's changed a lot of things, and a big one actually is the increased involvement of government in our lives, right? What that does is it takes a lot of responsibility off men, and it says, no, the government's going to take care of this now, right? So again, it's taking responsibility away from men. And personally, what I found and what I really think is men thrive on responsibility, right? So a man might not take initiative to take on a responsibility for himself, but when it's burdened on him, that's when he rises to the challenge. And so if we have a state where the government is taking care of a lot of the burdens on society, then I think the kind of cliche that we hear of happens, where men are sitting on benefits, watching TV or playing video games. I
mean, Jordan Peterson argues that there is an innate disposition or sense of manhood that modern society tends to corrupt or tends to undermine, and so I think he calls it the emasculation of a man, right? So a man no longer acts and behaves as for thousands of years men did act and did behave because of modern society, and he blames that on, as you said, the feminist movement and sort of a cause for equality and various other things. Now, I wonder whether from an Islamic perspective there is some correctness to what he's saying. We know that there is a concept called fitrah, and all human beings have this natural disposition. I suppose what I'm asking is, do you think there is a masculine disposition or a masculine fitrah?
It's very interesting to think about that. In terms of fitrah, I'm not quite comfortable talking in terms of fitrah, because I feel that's got its own Shari definition, right? But if you talk about an innate sense of manhood or natural masculine traits, then yes, I think that's there's no doubt about that. it's really hard to argue with that when you just look at nature, right? So biology wise, it's clear there are masculine traits and there are feminine traits. Yes, just on a biology level, right? Then when you look on the psychology level, again, it's clear, right? There's a really good book by Dr. Leonard Sachs. It's called Why Gender Matters, and there you can really, fully based on research and the psychology and even the physiology of the brain, how men and women or girls and boys are going to be different, right? So biology-wise, very clear that there's a difference between men and women, and therefore men are going to have specific innate traits. Psychology-wise, again, very clear, because how can you expect that men and women have completely different hormones running through their body, and their brain is operating a different way, and then the behaviors are not going to be different, or the attitudes or the ways of thinking are not going to be different? Of course they're going to be different, right? And so even if we put society aside, it's hard to believe that a woman wouldn't have different behaviors, attitudes, roles than a man, right? And then when we look across time and culture, now notice I haven't even got to what Allah is saying yet, right? Because all this is very self-evident, I think, right? If you just observe. When you look at, also, this is maybe the strongest point, is when you look across time and culture, you see common trends. And for me, that means that is natural, okay? So if we look across, let's say, we look across culture and time, okay? So 500 years ago and 2,000 years ago, and then look in the Middle East, look in Europe, look in China, yeah? You're going to find that people are battling each other, okay? So we can say that's natural. We're going to find people, you always find a group of people who are greedy, okay? So we can say that's natural, right? Equally, we find that across cultures and times, there were traits that men held, right? Now, were there exceptions in different cultures? Yes, but we're talking about the general rule, right? And did you have differences in cultures in the role that men played? Yes, but there's also a common thread, and that common thread is what we could call natural, masculine disposition.
That's really interesting. So, in your mind, that we tend to today, because of for all the reasons that you've mentioned, the shifts in society, we tend to push against those natural dispositions or inclinations that men have, and as a result, there is this vacuum and there is a problem in the lives of men. I mean, I had a startling statistic, and I can never remember statistics offhand, but it's about the number one killer of men in America is suicide, and large part of that of those suicides, or the reasons behind the suicides, is that men feel that they can no longer look after their families due to debt or out of work, or and I suppose that feeds into your thesis, your argument that men no longer have a place in this new world. When we look at the Muslim male, and I appreciate this is going to be a caricature and it's very generalized, but you mentioned Twitter earlier on, but when we observe the Muslim male, we often find that they do shoot from the hip, and a lot of the angst that is created on platforms like Twitter and Facebook, for sure, there are people out there, females out there who say things in order to solicit certain types of responses, but more often than not, young men are responsible for the anger and the frustrations and the sometimes quite bad behavior that exists on these social platforms. So I suppose if I was to turn this into a question, my question is it always a good thing to rely on these innate qualities, especially when these innate qualities often lead to quite bad results?
Yes, so I agree. It's not, especially for a Muslim, of course. Like maybe someone coming from another worldview would argue, whatever is natural, and just let it play out, or whatever, survival of the fittest, whatever. But no, as Muslims, we say, no, you don't just follow whatever comes to you. Whatever your desire is, you go and achieve that, or go out to get that. No, we have guidelines which make us in line with nature, right? Because obviously Allah created everything. Allah created the nature that men have and the women have. But then B is that the nature needs to be guided by the rules that Allah laid down for us and the guidance that Allah laid down for us. Okay, so yeah, it should be guided by that. So that's kind of what the book is trying to achieve, which is not only what makes a man masculine. I actually initially started with the idea of, okay, let's explore this. What makes a man masculine? And I think there are books from non-Muslims who kind of deal with that, like The Way of Men, okay, or just Way of Men. That is a book, obviously it's not coming from a Muslim worldview, but he's kind of pretty successfully, he successfully laid out the traits of men. Maybe some we would disagree with, some we would agree with, right? But that's like what makes someone masculine. But what we want to find out, that's what I decided. I don't want to find out what makes a man masculine. I want to find out what makes a good Muslim man. Okay, what is the model for masculinity that Allah wants, Allah will be pleased with, that Allah has given us? What's the role that Allah has given men? Okay, and it doesn't just come down to what Allah has made an obligation on men. No, it's further than that. What is the optimal man? What role does he play? What voluntary acts does he take up upon himself? You know, so yeah, definitely, it's not about. For example, men are, let's say, more aggressive than women. Definitely to compare with women, men are going to be more aggressive, right? Now, you could say that is going to make men into whatever rapists, for example, right? That is going to make men into rapists if they don't like completely control it, and if they don't have any moral compass. That might be the way they go down. But when we combine the aggression with the guidelines Allah has given us, what you find is a courageous man looking to defend his family, defend his nation, even defend a stranger when it comes to oppression, right? To stand up against oppression, right? And that is an example of the unique role that Allah has given us, right? So we have the aggression naturally, we have the testosterone, which allows us to prepare our body really to fight, if you like. We have maybe the courage that comes along with that, the risk-taking that comes along with that. And then Allah tells us to guide it in the correct direction. Okay, so you've got the aggression. Don't use it against women, you fool. Don't use it against, the weak. Use it against oppressors. Use it against when there's injustice being done, and really use it against yourself when you're not behaving correctly. Have that self-control.
So what role does revelation then play in refashioning or fashioning the man? And I note that in the piece I read from you suggested that you discovered a number of interesting conclusions as a result of your research, which tested even your original understanding or challenged your original worldview about masculinity. Can you share with us some of the findings that you put into your book?
Yeah, for sure. So the book is, still not completely finalized, but up until now, I mean, there's definitely been some clear conclusion in terms of things that are recommended for men to take on in terms of traits, right? And when it comes to looking at the revelation, obviously I went to the Quran, I went to the tafsir of the Quran, I went to the hadith, and not just what the Prophet told us to do, but like the stories behind it, right? And the context behind those hadith. And then you can look at the explanations of hadith and what scholars have said, etc., right? So a few interesting things. I think the number one thing that came up time and time again was self-control, okay? And how does this manifest in terms of the revelation and stuff? Well, if you think about one of the Prophet ﷺ, he said, I don't leave a bigger trial for the men than women, okay? And so when it comes to lowering the gaze, this is a daily, it depends where you live, but it could be a daily exercise in self-control, okay? And we have the great example of Yusuf alayhi salam, where, he was presented with that, temptation, and he rejected it, he refused it, right? So he had that self-control. That's a big one. Another one is, again, within self-control. It's, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, he said to a man, again, a man came to him, and the Prophet ﷺ, he gave us sometimes general advice, but sometimes it's very interesting to look into the context of when he was saying what, right? And so when he said, a man came to him and said, give me advice, he said, La taghdab, Don't get angry. Don't be angry. Okay, again, that's self-control, and it applies to women as well, right? But it's obvious that men are the ones who struggle with this more often than women, right? So control your anger. Another one, when a lot of the companions, they were wrestling, and they were trying to, competing and seeing, it's a classical thing that men like to do, to compete and see, okay, where are you in the hierarchy kind of thing. They're wrestling with each other, and the Prophet ﷺ, he came and he said, why are you wrestling? Of course he knows why they're wrestling. The obvious answer, he said, to see who's the strongest. And that's, out of that context, is a context that's very male driven, if you like. There's men and they're wrestling. And then what does he say to them? He said, ليس الشديد بالسرعة إنما الشديد الذي يملك نفسه عند الغضب. So the strong one is not the one who can wrestle. It's the one who can control himself when he gets angry. Okay, so he's kind of defining for them one of the big traits that throughout history we've, and until today, the macho man, the strong man, and it's something still important. I would even say it's part of the revelation that a man should be strong. But the Prophet ﷺ is actually indicating what's a bit more important than that is the self-control, right? So self-control was a big one that I found. Leadership is another one. So leadership, I feel like it goes into two categories. So there's leadership in the home, right? So obviously we have the hadith of Prophet ﷺ where he said, every one of you is a shepherd, and every one of you will be asked about their flock, right? And he mentioned that the man is the shepherd of his home, of his wife and children and his home. And so again, a man is a leader whether he likes it or not. So he must take on the traits of a good leader. And again, how do you define leadership? I mean, I honestly think some of the, the corporate kind of leadership books, they might be good, but the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba also laid out really good models for leadership, especially when it comes to humility and emotional intelligence when dealing with people, right? So leadership in the home, that's a big one. And obviously we know that Allah made the man the leader of the home. الرجال قوامون على النساء, and there's so much explanation of that ayah. But ultimately, a man must lead in the home. And often and that leads me to another trait, which is actually, this stuck out to me so much that I thought this is actually a key trait. And it's actually being gentle and being lenient with women, right? Rather than what you kind of alluded to about what happens on Twitter. And that's actually exactly what I thought of when I gathered all these kind of hadith about being careful and being gentle with women. That's exactly opposite sometimes what we see on Twitter, where the young men on Twitter are looking to fight with women, almost argue with women on a public platform, and make fun of them, laugh at them. This is absolutely the opposite of the model that Prophet ﷺ kind of came with, right? So leadership in the home, gentleness with women, being careful with women, being honestly, you could just say chivalrous, isn't it? What we know to be chivalrous with women. So those are a few. Then we have leadership outside the home, right? And that is when, it's easy to be the big man sometimes. It's easy to be the big man at home when, your wife is there, you're providing for your wife, your children, they're younger than you, and you're ordering people around, right? So that's sometimes a cliche of what some men are like, where they're just, big man in the house. As soon as they walk out and there are other men in the street, now he's the kitten, right? Whereas, it should be the opposite. He's a kitten in the home, he's a lion outside. So being a leader outside the home, a lot of that, interestingly, for example, in the Quran, Allah mentions multiple times the words وَجَاءَ مِنْ أَقْصَى الْمَدِينَةِ رَجُلٌ يَسْعَى. And the translation of that is approximately, and from the far side of the city, a man came rushing, or came striving forward, right? And what happens in these cases is that a man is coming and he's putting in a lot of effort from Aqsa al-Madinah. He's coming from the far end of the city to do something on a mission, right? And also it says yas'a. He's really putting effort and energy in getting there. You could say he's running, he's rushing to this scene. And what he's rushing towards is actually standing up for the truth in the face of an incorrect status quo. Okay, and like big example of this would be in Surah Yasin, when the man came and he said, "Ittabi'ul mursalun," follow the messengers, right? So imagine a big mob who rejecting the messengers, and this man comes from the other side and he tells them, he stands up in front of the whole mob and he says, "Follow the prophets, follow the messengers." Right, and obviously what we know from the surah is he was actually martyred after that, right? So he put his life on the line, and that is leadership. It's not saying who is going to, like, oh, the prophets are here, they'll deal with it, right? No, it's taking initiative. It's taking initiative without being asked, okay? And this is something that I think a big thing us Muslim men need to realize is that we thrive on challenges. We thrive on responsibility. But often the world will not put responsibility on you. You need to take it on yourself. You need to take it on for yourself. And just from my own observations, like, women actually take a lot of initiative, right? They'll get up and they'll do stuff, right? Especially if men are not filling that role, they'll go fill the role, right? And so then you get men complaining about how women are taking men's roles. Well, often it's because you're not filling the role yourself, right? So we need to take on that role. And interestingly, there is the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, if a woman just does a few things, right? Obey her husband, pray her prayers, fast her Ramadan, then she will enter Jannah from whatever gate she pleases, right? This is a very high status, right? The fact of the matter is a man doesn't have an equivalent hadith for how he can enter Jannah from any gate he pleases. And even if he was to enter any gate he pleases, we can imagine that he would have to actually go out and take on responsibility, right? Rather than just the few things that Prophet ﷺ listed for him. So therefore, generally something I've really come to terms with is that us men, we actually have to go out and take on the responsibility. No one's going to ask you to do it. No one's going to, if you're in the street and, like we hear about Muslim women being attacked in London or in America or whatever, and no one is going to point at you, Mr. Muslim man, and say, that's your sister, go protect her. No, you need to take it upon yourself. Maybe you're not visibly a Muslim, no one's going to know about, but Allah will know. Right? And this is your responsibility. So you have to take it on and you have to, go for it. Right? So that's like leadership outside the house. And another one, final one I'll just share with you, is actually interesting because, like I said, it did change my perspective on how a man should be. And this one is like being emotionally vulnerable, but in the right context. And you could say without losing your self-control. So we actually find that the prophets and the Sahaba, they're actually quite emotional people, okay? And so I don't think that men don't cry, that's too black and white. But also the whole metrosexual man who's just so open about his feelings and he just lets it all out in any context, that's also too black and white. I wouldn't say that's kind of in line with the Sunnah either. What I would say is a middle path here is that you feel emotion firstly. We have to be clear that men can and should have strong feelings, right? Now, when they express that and when they don't express that, you should have enough self-control to actually decide when you want to express it and when you don't. So, for example, in the presence of your wife, if you want to be vulnerable about something which actually she's relying on you for example, like financial security, if you let out your worries about your financial security to her, that's not the right place to do it. But then you can be open and vulnerable with your friends about that because they're not relying on you for that, right? Equally, when Musa was going to Fir'aun with his brother, he said to Allah, "Innana nakhaf." He said, "We are scared." How would he know that they're both scared unless they were emotionally open with each other to some level, right? So these are some of the five big ones that I've just kind of put together for you now. So self-control, leadership in the home, gentleness with women, leadership outside the home, standing up against the status quo, and then finally being emotionally vulnerable. And just you asked also about like how it changed my view, right? So my view of things, I suppose, is the old school, is the traditional way of seeing things, and that that's slightly different. It depends where you are in the world and stuff. But for example, what I kind of was used to is men being served by women in the house to a very, very high level in terms of, men not really lifting a finger. Now, they would work very hard outside the home, but once they're in the home, they're kind of not doing anything. And this is one example, but my view of that really changed when I thought of being a leader. And a leader takes initiative, right? He doesn't ask for his wife to do something. He'll go and do it, and maybe his wife would have so much respect for him that she cares for him. She'll say, no, I'll do that, that's fine. But you should have the initiative. You should be proactive and say, look, I'm not actually in need of anyone to do anything for me. I'm happy to do stuff. But if that's the role you have, then you can do that. If you want to volunteer to help me with it or do that for me, then do it. But my first kind of reaction is, no, I'll do it for myself. Yes, I believe it was Umar bin Khattab, when he was Khalifa, right? He dropped something off his horse or camel, and I think it was actually his slave who was going to pick it up for him, and he refused. He said, I'm going to get off my camel, I'm going to pick it up, because he said, I believe what he said to the slave, where the slave was like, why wouldn't you do that? He said, are you going to lift my sins on Yawm al-Qiyamah, right? So his attitude was very much one of independence and doing things for yourself.
You've set up some really interesting research there about the role of Muslim men, and I suppose that it begs the question, or a couple of questions in fact. Firstly, why is it that this narrative is missing in the Muslim community? I mean, surely the way you strung together a lot of these texts, I mean, these texts aren't foreign to many of us, right? Yeah. But maybe we haven't visualized the text in the context of manhood.
Yeah.
We took another story from it. So why is it that this development of the Muslim man is missing in our communities?
Yeah, I mean, it might be the simple fact that nobody is focused on it. And historically, I think it wasn't an issue, and that's why it wasn't focused on, right?
So you wouldn't find any scholarly books on Muslim masculinity, for example?
What I have found is books on futu'a and muru'a, right, which you could translate as chivalry. But when I go to those books, what I find is general good character, okay? Books on general good character. And I think what I've heard is that, especially before, the concept of being a good man, being a real man, it kind of applied to women as well, in the sense that they have muru'ah, they're a well-mannered person, they have great character. They kind of link that with chivalry, and it was like for men and women, you could say, because when you read these books like Sulami, I think Abdurrahman Sulami, he has a book, Kitab al-Futuwa, but when you read it, it's not so much only for men. That's how I would read it, at least in 2020. I went through it, and it's great, of course. It's great for character building, improving your character and how you are with people. But I don't think it really brought the answers for that a lot of men are asking. What is my role? How do I act when a woman provokes me in this context? And like what maybe men are dealing with on Twitter or whatever. What should a man do in the home? What shouldn't he do? I believe Sulami, he died in the 4th century Hijri, rahimahullah. So it was just not an issue at that time, and so I think that's why they didn't write about it. Just how you might not find 1,000-year-old books on mortgages. I think because a lot of the time. A lot of the good works are in Arabic, right? And in the Arab world, I think the whole issue of feminism and liberalism, I think they're only waking up to it now. Not in the sense that they didn't understand it, and they didn't understand it was there, but it's just become more of an issue maybe more recently. And so now you're going to find works being done, perhaps. In the meantime, I'll try, to do what I can. Obviously, I'm sure, real scholars of religion might do a better job than me, but it needs to be done, and so I'm trying my best.
I think you have an insight into the young Muslim male, which I think even many scholars would probably find very difficult to understand, and so that I think something, and it's more authentic. I would imagine, if it comes from someone of your age and someone of your experience, especially with that group of people. I'm just trying to understand why in Islamic history, I mean, I get your argument, and it's a very strong argument, that it just wasn't an issue. What about a counter argument to that, and that is often put forward by feminists, and that is that it was not an issue because women just had to accept their place in Islamic history, and men were these dominant beings, and they had, they were exercising their masculinity in a very negative way for centuries. And it's only now that Muslims have had to engage with liberalism and feminism and
so now we're struggling with it, yeah.
Now we're struggling with it, right? So it's more, we're being pushed into. I mean, you're being pushed into writing this book because you've been found out, right? And we've been found out as the male species for being for our failures over the last few centuries. I mean, that is a thought that does go through some of our minds. I mean, how would you address that?
Yeah. Oh, wow. There's so many angles I think we can approach that. I mean, firstly, so the basic argument they might say, right, is that so men have been dominant over women and mistreating women, you could say, or forcing them into roles that they don't necessarily fit up until now. And it's only now that we have the ability to counter this. Is that it, right? Right. Yeah. So, I mean, what does that say then about, for example, the Prophet ﷺ talking about, the first 3 generations are the best generations, right? And I think some scholars even say that doesn't just apply to the first 3 generations. It applies to the general concept that generations are getting worse over time and not better, right? And even when you look at the taqwa of the people in the past, how much closer to the fitrah, even you could say, even the non-Muslims were closer to the fitrah and therefore, better people than today. And it's important, I think, to separate between material progress and comfort and quality of life versus moral quality and social cohesion and general, contentment with life, right? I think those kind of, if you could put them into metrics, they might be going down, while comfort it goes up, right? So comfort, material wealth goes up, and those things are going down. So I would argue that as Muslims, what we're seeking in life, we're not seeking comfort per se. That's a luxury. That's a nice to have. We're seeking, closest to Allah, acceptance from Allah, and on a dunya level, we're seeking, some level of contentment, some level of safety, some level of good relationships with family and with the society around us. And therefore, surely we would look back in time for that and not today, right? So that's one argument. The other argument would be, I can't accept personally that women or men or any type of person would be put down for so long and be so uncomfortable in the position that society has forced them into, and they don't rebel, right? At some point, maybe you can hold them down for 100 years, maybe 200 years. But what we know from history is that it's a cycle, right? Empires fall, new empires come up. No matter how big the empire was, Ottoman Empire, British Empire, whatever, it crumbles. And so if women were being pushed into this, then I can't accept that. Oh, now you're saying now is the revolution after 1,400 years. No, I can't accept that women weren't actually okay with the way things were, because if they weren't okay and it was that bad, I think they really would. This rebellion or this revolution would have happened after 100 years, 200 years, but not 1,400 years. For me, that indicates there was a certain level of contentment with the way things were. And you can let's get out of the bubble of the West and 2020. 50 years ago, women in the West were happier than now. Yeah, I think there's a lot of data to show that. And in more traditional cultures, I think generally women are happier than in the West. So we don't even have to go too far to see that we're actually going the wrong way rather than the right way. Wallahu a'lam.
No, it's a very good answer. And I was reading today an article that someone submitted from Nigeria. Mm-hmm. My wife is putting together a book about feminism and the engagement and the interaction with Muslim women. she spoke about, she's written against feminism for some time, and she recently wrote this piece about how Muslim men often push women into feminism. And it was a very clever piece. I mean, she wasn't condoning feminism, but her argument was that through our actions and through the injustices and the absence of Islamic revelation and Islamic rights, or at least even if one accepts those rights, one doesn't actually abide by them. Muslim women can only really find solace in feminism and in Western rights because they go to the imam and they go to the community leaders and nothing seems to change, right? To what extent do you buy that argument, and do you think there is something substantial here that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I buy it fully. Full price, no discount. I think, like I said at the beginning, I'm happy to take on responsibility and admit failures. And I can't admit for failures of other men because it's everyone's responsible for themselves. But with the book, one of the messages I'm trying to send with the book is, let's admit, as men, we kind of do have some failures. So let's admit it and let's be leaders. Let's take responsibility and take initiative. So before we lose our women to feminism, if you want to word it that way, instead of it having to get to that, let's sort ourselves out. Let's be the best men we could be according to the Islamic model of masculinity. And then if the women still want to go to feminism, then, I don't know, what can we do about that? But what I would argue is, if we are men according to the Sunnah way of being a man, then the opposite would happen, to be honest. So I'm happy to say that sometimes we really fall short, and we can actually make many arguments and excuses for ourselves. We can say, the size of the government and how much they're involved in our lives, and the fact, for example, the fact that you can get benefits, right, in the UK, you're not working. You could say, oh, that really doesn't incentivize me to work. You could say that, and therefore, you would say I'm not being a proper man and not working hard and this and that. So you can make excuses, but forget excuses. Let's just take on responsibility. Let's be the best we can be. And ultimately, you got to take those excuses to Allah as well. So let's be honest with ourselves.
What has led to this absence of Islamic thinking in a variety of areas? And, you're focusing on the role of a Muslim man, but it's a very basic problem that we face, but if we expand it in every area, right? When it comes to marriage, when it comes to living in a community, when it comes to trade or whatever it may be, there is a palpable absence of the Islamic thought, right? And we don't really have details. We may have, a hadith here, or we may have some notion of what is right from the wider community, from imams, but we don't really have specifics. And I suppose a task you're trying to do is you're trying to flesh out the specifics so that a Muslim is rightly guided rather than just generally guided, and as a result, that general guidance leads into error. I'm trying to understand, why is it that our communities, and in the Muslim world, I mean, it's no different, right? If you go to Pakistan or Nigeria, but also in the West, why is it that our communities there is a failure to explain the depth and the details of Islam in a way that you want to do with this book?
Yeah, that's a big question, Jalal.
Ameen, I mean, like you and I mean, I'm older than you, right? But when I was, alhamdulillah, my parents are, fantastic parents, and they've got, given me so much. But what is clear is, they did not inherit from their parents, a detailed Islamic culture to deal with these issues, right? So something down the line went wrong, in a whole array of areas, and we're focusing on men, but because ideally, I would imagine, and I'm sure you do this, you'll be explaining to your children what it means to be a man from an Islamic context at a very early age. And I suppose that's the Islamic method, right? We're not going to rely on a state to tell us how to be a men. We're going to rely on our family and our parents and our fathers to do that, right?
Yeah.
So what went wrong in that chain? And why is it that we've ended up where we are? Yeah.
Maybe we haven't. Maybe nothing went wrong, right? So I'll explain. Let's say, if you're from Pakistan originally, your parents, let's say, were born in Pakistan, their grandparents were born in Pakistan. They had a general, or maybe I'm wrong here, but they had a general Islamic culture. Okay, so generally the way they lived their lives was according to Islam. Were they educated in Islam? Maybe not. Could they quote hadith or any? No, maybe they couldn't. Right, but this is what I believe. I don't believe that we need to expect every individual to have a good Islamic education to have a good society. I believe that we just need to have the culture and the norms of the culture and the society to make sure everyone's in line with the Islamic values, right? And so I think in the past, that's how things were kind of maybe better than now, at least values-wise, is because people actually didn't need to be educated on how to be good. It was just a general norm of the culture is that this is good and this is bad, right? Now, what has happened, I think we're in a transition phase now, where now there is questions about what is good and what is bad, okay? And now that's when we need to expect every individual get educated on what's good and bad, because the culture is not so clear. The culture is not homogenous anymore. There's globalization. There's, even if you're in Mauritania now, you're being exposed to YouTube, right? And so the mind is actually being filled with so many different ideas and sometimes clashing ideologies. So now it's like, okay, I guess we have to react, right? Ideally, we would have educated everyone. I'm not saying that's not ideal, but I'm saying it's probably a big ask. If you ask me, and I'm not a historian, but I would guess that the average Muslim in the past did not have an amazing Islamic education, but the culture that they lived in led them to living generally moral lives in line with Islamic values. But now, because we're in the transition phase, because we're adapting to the new world where there's globalization, there's let's be real, attacks on our values. Now we kind of do need to expect everyone to be educated to an extent to combat that.
That really allows me to talk about culture and the impact Western culture, if you like, or liberal culture has had on the young Muslim male. Because, again, I haven't studied this and I haven't, but anecdotally, I would imagine we're all products of our culture, right? We may claim we're not, but we all are impacted by foreign cultures or by cultures of others. But I would imagine young people today are extremely impacted by liberal culture, and as you said, it's just through their smartphone and what they watch and what they are consumed with. I would imagine you agree with that, and if that is the case, how is it that we can reverse something so intimate? Never has there been a civilization that's been able to reach you at every minute of the day like Western liberal culture can.
Yeah. Obviously, it's a big question, but I have obviously my own ideas around this. I think you try to actually design or engineer your environment with clear intention. So actually, on my podcast, Mind Heist, I think it was episode 79. I interviewed somebody he's African American, and he was actually working in Medina, in the city of the Prophet ﷺ, and he left that to live on a farm in the US, right? Because he said that this lifestyle and this setup is going to be better for raising his family and living a more Islamic life in touch with the ideal way of living, right? With less distractions, less fitan, etc. around him, right? So that's an example of really intentionally designing a life around what you want in the end, right? So that's kind of, you could say that's an extreme example where he's like taking it his whole life and moving it. But maybe I can share, because I can't say I have the absolute answer on this, but I can share what I do, right? So I don't have Instagram. I don't have Snapchat. I don't have TikTok. My Facebook usage is limited to 30 minutes a day. My YouTube is limited, again, to think it's 90 minutes a day that I do, but that's a maximum, right? It just means I can't go beyond that. And also, I've turned off recommended videos. I've turned off the comments on YouTube, and also I can't use YouTube outside of certain hours of the day, right? So it's rare that I'm even going to be able to use it 90 minutes a day, right?
Are you Jason Bourne or something?
but this is a way to engineer your environment, so it's the temptation actually doesn't even exist anymore, because I've removed the even ability to do some of those things that I've just decided intentionally I don't want to do that, right? Again, I choose to live in a Muslim country, and this is like the things I've mentioned are ways to avoid media or these influences impacting you too much, right? It's like it's actually one action that you can do, and that you kind of can forget about it after that. You don't have to constantly put effort into it. But then beyond that, in terms of ongoing kind of stuff you can do, what I think is educate yourself, right? Because Allah loves the strong Muslim. And that includes being mentally strong, being aware of, in the course that you taught, the Thinking Muslim, is what are the origins of liberalism? What's the origins of the materialistic society we live in? Where does that actually come from? This will empower you, I think, right? Especially getting to the sources of it. Then history, I think, is fundamental, again, in making you strong mentally. And also allows you to question the current bubble that we're living in, right? So a lot of people, the automatic way of thinking is that the way things are now is the way things have always been, right? And it's just an automatic bias that we have, that we just think this is how it is. But obviously that's not true. We kind of really do. We live in a location bubble, a time bubble, a class bubble, maybe a race bubble. Like, we live in so many bubbles. So history allows you to escape that bubble. Traveling, of course, helps. And generally, I think being in touch with nature. And then finally, obviously, creating our own media is a way. And I don't just mean, there's good stuff being done, ilm feed and this and that. But it's also having media that's not necessarily Islamic per se in an obvious way. It's like, where's the Muslim National Geographic? Where's the Muslim like cooking shows or whatever? It can be a bit informal, right? But as long as it's in line with the values, it's fine, right? So yeah, those are like three areas, I guess. Intentionally designing your environment, trying to develop yourself, your mind, educating yourself. And then on a proactive thing, like, we need to either create our own media or contribute to media. I always try and encourage people to, if you're going to donate money, put 10% aside or 20% aside of whatever you're going to give to something which is more long term, like supporting like institutions, media thing. Like, I understand there is a urgency of emergencies and food packs and people are starving, 100%. But just put a little bit aside to actually build the long-term institutions as well.
In designing your environment, I mean, that requires a lot of self-restraint, right? You've got to, what I would imagine, especially in today's world, young people, again, I'm speaking like I'm 60 or something, but young people tend to have very little self-restraint because the commercialized world in which they live, it is very much about instant gratification. So one would have to have a lot of self-discipline to be able to do that, I would imagine.
Well, I'll give you an example, right? So now it's 7:20 where I am, At 10 p.m., I won't be able to access YouTube, right? There won't be a way for me to access YouTube. I can't do it, right? So there is no restraint. Like, I just can't do it, right?
So why can't you do that?
Oh, because I've actually got a software that blocks it for me. Right? And that software, I've actually set it up. I mean, you can have different layers of how much you want it to be, so you can't control it anymore. But I've got it set so I can't control it, right? I can't make changes to it. So, people think that's crazy. And I think a lot of people, they like the idea that, no, I'm in control, I'm strong enough. But what I always say to them is that there are engineers, software engineers working at Instagram. They're so smart and in demand that they're getting paid $300,000 a year, and they're working 40 hours a week to keep you on their platform. And you somehow think, you're naive enough to think you can resist that. You know, they're smart people. It's a full-time job for them. For you, it's not a full-time job to resist them and to fight them, right? So that's why I enlist the help of other software engineers to use the software to block it.
And back to your book, I mean, I can imagine you're going to produce additional material surrounding your book to publicize it, as well as to express some of the ideas in a bite-sized form. But is there a place to have a mentoring course of some sort for young Muslim men, so that you can bring to life some of the ideas in your book and explain these ideas to them in a more live sense?
Yeah, but I think, Jalal, that a course would be great. But I think ultimately the difference and the missing link here is because, like we referred to Twitter, and Twitter, I don't know, it's kind of a place where you kind of you put your finger on the pulse of young, even you could say young religious Muslims in the UK or US, right? And over there, you find even those who have some level of Islamic education, they don't have the character to go with it, right? And I think that is the gap. I think tarbiyah is the gap, right? And how do you develop tarbiyah? I really think it's very difficult to develop it online, like through online means. I think you need to get people in a room, in a masjid, in a football pitch. I think that's how it's done. And so, you know, when I look to like raising my son, inshallah, that's all I'm thinking. I'm thinking real life stuff. I'm not thinking about teaching him the stuff I've talked about on this podcast. I'm thinking of just trying to live that model, right, of masculinity, and also just put him in the environment where he can just gain it naturally, where I think, you know, our parents, grandparents, they took it on naturally. You know, if I think of like stuff like Duke of Edinburgh, have you heard of that?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, like it's a very like what's the word? I guess it's a softy version of what, you know, our grandparents were up to as children. But I think this, as well as, you know, martial arts, these things is the tarbiyah we need, right? And obviously, when it comes to Islamic education, it's very important as well. But the education is not just knowledge; it's knowledge and action. And you get action through seeing your teacher and your teacher holding you accountable. So we need to have more of a murabbi system than just a muallim system. You know,
we are finding here in the West that things are getting more and more difficult for us to live out our Islamic lives. And it's not just the cultural aspects that we've spoken about, but it's more of the sort of political aspects and the, you know, the hatred that our community faces is now quite palpable, especially in some quarters in Britain and in Europe. You know, in Belgium, we heard our sisters now can't wear hijab at the universities, and Belgium was held a few years back as an example of multiculturalism. So things are changing, and things are changing quite quickly. To what extent is it a fool's errand to think about building long-term our communities here in the West? And maybe we should do what you did, right? And move and make an intention to move away and move to the Muslim world. I appreciate the Muslim world isn't perfect, but at least we're with Muslims and we're able to, we have some, you know, dare I say, I mean, you know, we claim that we have freedom here, but actually I would imagine for a Muslim in UAE or in Qatar or in other Muslim countries, there's far more freedom to live your Islamic life than there is in these countries. Yeah.
So is it a fool's errand? I mean, I ultimately, I think we'll find out with time, right? So I don't want to theorize on it too much, but maybe you could get my answer from where I live now. But I find it difficult, honestly, to tell people what to do in that sense, or because, like I told you earlier, I didn't grow up in the West, so I don't have a very close attachment to any specific country. So I understand that it's easy for me to pick up and leave, right? Even where I am now, I can pick up and leave, right? I'm not attached. There's good things and there's bad things about that, right? Yeah, you've got to really think of, I think history helps here. I think looking at history helps. I think looking at the trajectory helps. and the trajectory, like you said, is not good, right? On the flip side, where is the trajectory good? You know, even in the Muslim world, where is trajectory good? In some countries, things are kind of staying kind of the same. I mean, no, you know what? That's not even true. Things are changing in most of the world, and in most countries, things are getting worse. But maybe what it is finding pockets. So it's not about picking the country to live in; it's about picking the community to live in, right? So, like the brother that I interviewed, Sharif, he left Medina to go and live in New Mexico in the US, right? And he has, so he's not picked the country, you know, you can see that. Like, he's not even picked the city, because obviously what's the best city, you know, is the city of the Prophet ﷺ. He's not even picked the city, he's picked the environment and the people. So he's got a farm in New Mexico. And I even said to him, you know, the Prophet ﷺ, he said that those who stay with the people and they mix with the people and they put up, they're patient with the trials of living with people, that person is better than the one who just kind of runs away. And he said, well, I'm not running away. He's like, I'm living amongst people here, right? But the non-Muslims I'm around, they're much more kind of conservative. They're farmers, they're simple people, good people. And I'm actually trying my best to bring Muslim families over to live near me so we can have our community out here, right? And interestingly, he said, in Ramadan, when everyone was like doing lockdown and no Taraweeh and this and that, he said, we're doing Taraweeh and we're having Iftar together because we're in an isolated area where it's funny, like there's no control. Whereas in Egypt or whatever, people are cancelling Taraweeh. But over there in a rural setup, people weren't actually controlling what they can and can't do when it comes to like gathering and stuff. So I think that's interesting to think about. And maybe another example, like maybe the west of Algeria is there's a better community there than in the east of Algeria. So within countries, you're going to find different areas. But it's difficult to see how there will be a place that you can just decide on for a multi-generational kind of settlement where you're like, okay, I'm here for the next 10 generations. I think a lot of changes are going to happen. And so maybe it's about just thinking 2 or 3 generations ahead. Where is a place that things are maybe getting a little bit better or they're not going downhill as much? And where is a place where there's already a good community where I don't have to do all the parenting? Like, there's nothing wrong with parenting. Like, parenting is important and good. But what I mean is that you need a community around you to raise your children, not just you, right? They don't need, they might see you being a good role model as a man or whatever, how to be a good husband or a good father or a good sibling. But then if all the other, uncles in the community are not like that, that's not going to work, right? So how can you find circles of people? And it might just be a group of 10 families where you feel like, yeah, in these 10 families, 8 out of 10 of these men, I'm happy for my son to learn how to be a man from these people, right? And it's, 10 families seems more achievable when you say it like that, right?
I think it's profound what you're saying. We need to design our lives and we need to design our environment and our community. And not just sort of, leave it to fate, right? And leave it to the sort of the natural consequences of things. And I think you're absolutely right. You can find communities in London where you have an amazing relationship with the masjid and with the community, and there's a lot going on. And Tarbiyah is you have good Islamic schools and Islamic seminaries, and there's a lot going on, right? And then, as you said, you can move 5 miles away, and none of that is available.
Obviously, on a general picture, it's better to do that in a Muslim country, probably, especially more conservative or traditional Muslim countries. Again, the culture is just set where people have these general Islamic etiquettes. I mean, again, that's where traveling comes in. It's like, I always refer to Algeria because I know Algeria. If you go to Algeria, you find people who, they don't know many surahs. They've never studied beyond just, the basics in school, because they do still study like fiqh and stuff in school. Beyond that, they've never studied Islam. They never attended any lecture. Maybe even, they don't have the outward appearance of someone who's religious, but their values are actually very Islamic. Their manners, they generally understand. Like in Algeria, for example, sometimes you might, instead of saying please, you actually make dua for the person, right? These things are ingrained, and so I think there's a lot to benefit from that in terms of living in a Muslim country, Muslim majority country.
Jazakallah khair. That's really interesting. So when can we get a chance to read your book? When do you think the book will be published?
So in Ramadan was May, wasn't it? So what I said is, inshallah, I'll be done within 6 months of Ramadan. So I guess we got a few months to go. The draft is pretty much done, but as you probably would, I don't know if you've written books yourself, but
it's a long process.
Yeah, it's a long process between like the draft and the final thing. So maybe I'm naive, Jalal. Maybe it's going to take longer, but inshallah not.
Inshallah.
I guess where people could find out about it when it is ready is so I'll definitely would have mentioned it on my YouTube channel. That's like maybe where I'm the most active. So YouTube channel is Seera Masters, SEERA Masters. Seera Masters, that's my YouTube channel. That's also where I put the video version of the podcast. So those two things are found there. And I guess if you subscribe there, then that's the best place to find me.
Well, Jazakallah khair, Ameen, for joining us today. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you the best in your endeavors, inshallah, and allow us to gain from your research and your knowledge and help the Muslim and the Muslim community for many years to come, inshallah ta'ala.
Ameen, Ya Rab. And same for you. May Allah put barakah in in the project, the Thinking Muslim, and allow us to be thinking Muslims, properly thinking Muslims. And just keep it up, inshallah. And I think we just got to, this is really what you're doing is an example of leadership and taking responsibility. Nobody told you have to do this, I'm sure. You chose to do it because you understand that it's not enough to sit back and watch things crumble. That would be regretful. So may Allah put barakah in the endeavor of taking on that leadership.
Ameen, inshallah. And now I can say to my nephews and nieces that I've spoken to Ameen from Mind Heist and conducted a podcast. So maybe they'll start listening to a podcast now, inshallah.
Maybe, inshallah. Many good guests on it, mashallah.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.